The heavy iron gates of Ironwood Penitentiary didn't just close, they groaned with a finality that seemed to swallow the very air. For Julian, a 30-year-old former architect whose only crime was being in the wrong place during a corporate fraud investigation, the sound was a physical blow. He stood in the intake center, his tailored shirt replaced by a rough, oversized orange jumpsuit that hung off his lean frame. At 30, he wasn't a kid, in the biological sense, but in the predatory ecosystem of Ironwood, his clean-shaven face and wide, observant eyes made him look like a newborn lamb. He was the innocent kid, a man who still smelled of expensive espresso and blueprint paper. Now thrust into a world of concrete, diesel, and ancient grudges. The hierarchy of Block C was dominated by a man they called the Titan. He was a mountain of a human being, a man in his late 50s whose skin was a map of prison history, etched with tattoos that told stories of wars fought behind these very walls. The Titan didn't participate in the petty squabbles of the yard. He sat on a concrete bench like a king on a throne, his silence more terrifying than any shout. Under him was a group of scavengers led by a man named Jax, a mid-level enforcer who thrived on breaking the spirits of those who still had a flicker of hope in their eyes. Jax had been watching Julian since the moment he stepped off the transport bus, marking him as a high-value target for harassment. The harassment began almost immediately. It wasn't the physical violence that wore Julian down at first, but the systematic stripping of his dignity. His food tray was constantly flipped, his meager canteen credits were taxed by Jax's crew, and he was never allowed to sleep for more than an hour before a heavy boot would kick his cell bars. Julian tried to maintain his composure, using the mental discipline he'd honed in his professional life, but the environment was designed to erode even the strongest foundations. By the end of the first week, the circles under his eyes were dark as bruises, and his hands, once steady enough to draw intricate structures, began to tremble. The situation reached a breaking point during the afternoon recreation hour. The yard was a swirling mass of heat and aggression, but a pocket of focused malice formed near the north wall. Jax and 4 of his men had cornered Julian, pushing him against the chain-link fence. They weren't after his money this time. They wanted a small, silver locket Julian had managed to keep hidden, a memento of his wife, the only thing that reminded him he was a human being with a name. Jax demanded the locket, his voice a low, jagged rasp that promised a long and painful afternoon if Julian didn't comply. Julian, fueled by a sudden, desperate surge of defiance, shook his head and clutched the silver piece to his chest. The yard went silent. Hundreds of inmates stopped their walking, their eyes turning toward the confrontation. It was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the breaking of the new guy. Jax smirked, a jagged, toothless expression, and raised a sharpened shiv made from a toothbrush handle. He told Julian that in Ironwood, memories were a luxury he couldn't afford. As Jax stepped forward to deliver a strike meant to humble the newcomer, a shadow fell over the group. It wasn't a guard. It was a presence that felt like a shift in the local gravity. The Titan had moved from his throne. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the yard. The Titan didn't run, he walked with a slow, rhythmic deliberateness that made the gravel crunch like breaking bone. Jax froze, the shiv still raised, his bravado evaporating like mist in a furnace. He looked at the Titan, trying to find a reason for the interruption, but the king's face was a mask of cold, unyielding stone. The Titan stood between Julian and the scavengers, his massive frame completely obscuring Julian from view. He didn't say a word to Jax. He simply looked at the raised hand holding the weapon. The Titan's move was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. He didn't adopt a fighting stance, he didn't growl. He simply reached out and placed a single, massive hand on Julian's shoulder. It wasn't a grip of aggression, but a claim. He was marking Julian as untouchable. The message was clear to every man in the yard: to touch the architect was to challenge the throne. Jax's hand began to shake, the sharpened plastic clicking against his own knuckles. He knew that the Titan hadn't intervened in a yard dispute in over 5 years. The king had spoken through his silence, and the decree was final. The Titan finally spoke, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to come from the very earth beneath their feet. He told Jax that the yard was becoming noisy, and he preferred the quiet. He suggested that Jax and his crew find something else to occupy their time before he decided to personally ensure the silence remained permanent. Jax, his face pale and his eyes darting toward the guards who were conveniently looking at the clouds, lowered his weapon. He didn't mutter a comeback. He simply backed away, his crew following him like whipped curs, disappearing into the crowd of inmates who were now staring at Julian with a new kind of terror. Julian stood there, his back against the fence, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked up at the Titan, expecting a demand or a price for the protection. But the King of Ironwood didn't look back. He kept his hand on Julian's shoulder for a moment longer, a heavy, grounding weight that seemed to transfer a fraction of his own iron-willed strength into the younger man. He then looked at the silver locket in Julian's hand and told him, in a voice only Julian could hear, to keep his memories buried deep, because the walls of Ironwood had long ears and hungry stomachs. The king's move didn't just save Julian, it silenced the entire wing. For the rest of the day, the usual shouting and clanging of the block was replaced by a wary, respectful hum. Julian walked back to his cell, and for the first time, no one tripped him. No one hissed threats. He sat on his bunk, looking at the silver locket, realizing that he had survived the first layer of hell only to be claimed by the master of the second. He knew the Titan didn't do anything for free, and the protection of a king always came with a heavy tax. As the sun began to set, casting long, barred shadows across the floor, Julian saw a shadow move outside his cell. It was one of the Titan's inner circle, a man who functioned as the king's messenger. He didn't enter, he simply leaned against the bars and told Julian that the Titan had a use for a man who knew how to design things. He told Julian that tomorrow, the architect would begin a new project, one that didn't involve blueprints for buildings, but blueprints for an escape. Julian realized then that his innocence hadn't been his shield, it had been his currency. The real game was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. The first night under the Titan's protection was the quietest Julian had experienced since entering Ironwood, but it was far from peaceful. The absence of the usual shouting and clanging was replaced by a heavy, expectant silence that felt like the indrawn breath of a predator. Julian lay on his cot, staring at the concrete ceiling, the weight of the Titan's hand still seemingly pressing down on his shoulder. He knew that in a place like this, innocence was merely a lack of experience, and protection was just another word for ownership. By morning, the whispers had already solidified into a new reality. The architect was no longer a victim, he was an asset. And in Block C, assets were managed with cold, surgical precision. True to the messenger's word, Julian was pulled from the general labor detail the following morning. While the rest of the inmates were sent to the laundry or the machine shop, Julian was escorted by a silent guard, one who clearly took orders from the Titan rather than the warden, to a secluded area of the prison's old library. The library was a graveyard of forgotten knowledge, filled with dust-covered volumes and broken furniture. Waiting for him in the back, sitting behind a heavy oak table that looked like it had been there since the prison was built, was the Titan. The King of Ironwood didn't look like a prisoner in that moment, he looked like a general planning a campaign. He pushed a stack of weathered, hand-drawn schematics across the table toward Julian. The Titan told Julian that the prison wasn't just built on stone, it was built on flaws. He explained that the original architects of Ironwood had been more concerned with the aesthetics of punishment than the structural integrity of containment. He pointed to a specific section of the north wing, an area where the foundation met an old underground drainage system that had been sealed off in the 1970s. The Titan's voice was low, a rhythmic rumble that seemed to vibrate the very dust in the air. He told Julian that he didn't need a man to dig a hole, he had plenty of muscle for that. He needed a man who understood the stress points of the machine, a man who could tell him exactly where the stone would fail before a single hammer strike was made. Julian looked at the maps, his professional instincts warring with his moral compass. As an architect, he saw the lines and the loads, the way the weight of the massive granite blocks was distributed. He saw exactly what the Titan saw, but with a clarity that only a decade of design experience could provide. He realized that the Titan wasn't just planning a simple breakout, he was planning a structural collapse that would paralyze the facility's security systems. Julian asked the question that had been burning in his mind since the yard: why him? Why protect an innocent man just to turn him into a conspirator? The Titan leaned forward, his massive hands interlaced on the table. He told Julian that innocence was the perfect camouflage. No guard would suspect the kid, who spent his time sketching in the library, of being the mastermind behind a structural breach. But more importantly, the Titan admitted that he respected Julian's refusal to give up the locket. He said that a man who clings to a memory when death is staring him in the face is a man who can be trusted with a secret. In the Titan's world, loyalty wasn't bought with money, it was forged in the fire of shared desperation. He told Julian that if he completed the blueprints for freedom, his name would be the first one on the list of those walking out the gate when the walls finally came down. For the next 3 weeks, Julian lived a double life. By day, he was the quiet, unassuming inmate who spent his hours among the dusty books, seemingly lost in his own thoughts. By night, his mind was a whirlwind of structural calculations and load-bearing variables. He became the Titan's most trusted advisor, moving through the prison under a cloak of invisibility granted by the king's decree. Even Jax and his crew, once the source of Julian's nightmares, now crossed the hallway when they saw him coming, their eyes filled with a mixture of envy and fear. The harassment had been replaced by a terrifying level of respect that felt even heavier than the threats. But as the date of the breach approached, Julian discovered the true nature of the Titan's plan. While auditing the old maintenance logs, he realized that the structural collapse the Titan was planning wouldn't just affect the North Wing, it would destabilize the entire Black Sea, where hundreds of inmates who weren't part of the escape were housed. The Titan wasn't just looking for a way out, he was willing to bury the unnecessary souls of Ironwood to cover his tracks. The king's move in the yard hadn't been an act of mercy, it had been a cold, calculated investment in a tool that could build him a bridge out of hell, regardless of who was crushed beneath it. The final confrontation took place in the library, the night before the scheduled strike. The air was thick with the scent of impending storm. Julian stood his ground, much like he had in the yard, and told the Titan that he wouldn't finish the calculations. He told the king that he might be a prisoner, but he wasn't a murderer. He offered a counter-proposal, a different exit strategy that utilized the old ventilation shafts, one that would be slower and riskier for the Titan, but wouldn't cost a single life. He looked the mountain of a man in the eyes, holding the locket in his hand as a reminder of the man he still was. The Titan rose from his chair, his shadow stretching across the room like a dark shroud. The silence was deafening, the same silence that had paralyzed the yard weeks ago. He moved toward Julian, his hands tightening into fists that could cave in a skull. But then, the Titan stopped. He looked at the blueprints, then back at the innocent kid, who had found the courage to tell a king, no, twice. A slow, grim smile touched the Titan's lips, the first time anyone in Ironwood had seen him show a human emotion. He told Julian that he was a fool, but a fool with a foundation. He accepted the alternative plan, realizing that Julian's innocence was a strength that even he couldn't break. The escape was a whispered legend for years after. There was no explosion, no collapse, and no blood. Just a series of doors that shouldn't have opened and a ventilation grate that led to a world that had forgotten them. On the night they reached the outer perimeter, the Titan stood at the edge of the woods, looking back at the dark towers of Ironwood. He turned to Julian and told him that his debt was paid. He said that the world would still think Julian was a criminal, but the king of Ironwood knew the truth. As they disappeared into the night in separate directions, Julian felt the weight of the locket against his chest, finally realizing that the Titan's move hadn't silenced the yard, it had awakened the architect within him. He wasn't the kid anymore, he was the man who had redesigned his own fate.